Hello, everyone. So wonderful to see so many folks joining us today. My name is Megan Toll, and I'm an engagement advisor with BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm calling today from the unceded ancestral territory and lands of the Syilx Okanagan people. I want to acknowledge that as we gather virtually today, we live and work on the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples across BC, and we share our gratitude to do this work on these lands. And we also share our gratitude, as I mentioned, that you have taken time to be here with us today. And we thank you so much for joining to learn more about the Commissioner's recently released report, Rights in Focus, Lived Realities in BC. I'm going to back us up just for a moment, just in case some folks aren't familiar with the work of our office, to just give a very brief overview of what we do. So BC's Human Rights Commissioner is an independent officer of the legislature, and her office exists to address the root causes of inequality, discrimination, and injustice in our province by shifting laws, policies, practices, and cultures. And we do this work in many different ways, but particularly through education, research, policy advocacy, public inquiry, and monitoring. So the Rights in Focus report is a culmination of some of that work. And in a moment, I will introduce BC's Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari Govender, to share more about the report. And over the next 45 minutes, the Commissioner will provide not only an overview of the contents of the report, but also information and context about why we produced this piece of work, its purpose, and how the work was done as well. Toward the end of this session, we also hope to have some time for Q&A. So please ensure that you are submitting questions via the Q&A application on the Zoom. So this would be a good time to do a little bit of housekeeping about the Zoom platform that we are using here today. I know folks are probably pretty familiar with Zoom, but we always want to make sure everyone's on the same page with how it's being used. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see the chat and Q&A functions available. So these two are only going to be visible to myself, and we also have Chitha from our team supporting with tech in the background today and with Q&A and the chat. So we'll keep an eye on that throughout the session, and as questions come up, as we're sharing about the report today, we'll do our best to go through as many as we can when we get toward the end of the webinar. And some folks also submitted some really great questions when they registered, which we also hope to be able to address. You may also notice that we have ASL interpretation available today. So big thank you to our support on that end. And closed captioning can also be accessed by clicking on those two C's that should also be at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I would like to welcome BC's Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari Govender, and I will hand it over to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks for starting us off in a good way, and thank you to all of you for joining us here today. Like Megan, I want to ground my comments today in both the gratitude and the responsibility that we bear having these conversations on Indigenous territories. And today I am on Lekwungen territory, including the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations here in what's now known as Victoria. We are here today to speak, as you know, about our new report entitled Rights in Focus, Lived Realities in BC, which details 10 systems which are essential to the fulfillment of human rights. The report details the ways in which inequalities and injustices are built right into these systems. Exploring the systems themselves is an important way to determine really the state of human rights in BC. The systems we selected for this piece of research and for this report are the primary systems impacting our social, economic, and political lives. And they reflect what we heard from community members about where human rights issues most often show up in their lives. Our selection of issues will likely be unsurprising to most people if you haven't had a chance to look through the report. I think you won't be terribly surprised because a lot of the issues are pretty top of mind for many British Columbians. But what's maybe less obvious is how these issues are really at the heart about human rights and how the issues impact marginalized people in our communities in particular. And that's why we released this report, to put rights in focus, as we say in the title. We intend to replicate the Rights in Focus report every 3 years and examine the same key issues with different spotlights on lived experience. So the report has a summary of some of the key issues related to the heading, to the subject area, and then does a spotlighted deep dive on just one particular issue. My hope is that this series will provide a useful snapshot of human rights in BC going forward, showing where there's opportunities to create social and legal change and how the human rights landscape of BC is evolving over time. My office first developed this first report of the series, I should say, by conducting community-based research, a survey of direct service organizations, sectoral community grants, and secondary research. Most importantly, the report is based on a really deep listening to communities of people with lived experience of human rights issues. And I want to thank each and every person, every community, every organization who shared their experiences and their perspectives with us. And I hope that those folks, maybe some of you who've joined us today, see yourselves reflected in this work. Before I speak to the human rights issues in each of the key systems we examined, I want to spend a few minutes reviewing the purposes and the parameters of the report. So as we mentioned, BC OHRC, or BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, initiated the project to capture the current state of human rights in the province, creating a kind of baseline that can be used to monitor change over time. And the goals of the work were really threefold. First, to enhance awareness and understanding among British Columbians about the state of human rights across the province and empower them to create change with this knowledge. To educate decision makers in government and other duty bearers and leverage opportunities to make change. And on that note, very grateful for all those from government who are joining us here today. And to embed community identified human rights issues and solutions in BC OHRC's ongoing work to inform meaningful and effective social change activities. So really to inform our work as an organization as well. The report is not by any means a comprehensive look at every human rights issue in the province, nor does it contain detailed policy analysis or recommendations for change, which if you followed our work, you may know is unusual for us. Normally in every other piece of work, we've issued recommendations. In this one, we really wanted to talk about what is the state of human rights without getting into that next stage, so that collectively we can build those solutions together. So instead, the report is really intended to reflect what we heard in community and of course what secondary research, what the surveys showed us as well, about the issues creating and perpetuating inequalities and injustices in our province. Our hope is that the report will be helpful to advocates and decision makers alike in devising solutions to these issues. Many of the systems we review are relevant to the protection of economic and social rights. These are our rights to the necessities of life. International human rights law obligates governments to take appropriate steps towards the full realization of these rights. Under international law, economic rights, and that includes things like the right to adequate standard of living, the right to housing, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, an international law protects those rights. These protections are detailed, for example, in the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which Canada ratified in 1976 with the support of all the provinces and territories. And that support there is key. International law binds all governments in BC, including provinces in Canada, including the provinces and the territories. But this one is significant because the provinces actually did agree. They went through a process and agreed to Canada signing on. The covenant requires the progressive realization of these rights to the maximum of available resources. So let's break that down. This means that governments have an obligation to take appropriate steps towards the full realization of these rights. While economic rights have largely not been incorporated into domestic law, into Canadian law, or to the law in BC, and therefore lack enforceability here in some ways, our Human Rights Code here in BC grants me, as the Human Rights Commissioner, the responsibility for promoting and protecting human rights, including by promoting compliance with international human rights obligations, such as those imposed by the convention I was just talking about. So while economic and social rights such as the adequate standard of living have not been protected here in Canada and BC, it doesn't mean that we don't have those rights here. In fact, part of my job is protecting those rights, and that's why we built them into the report in the way that we did. Also, even where we don't have explicit protections for these rights, Canadian and BC law does protect our rights to equality. Importantly, this means understanding that equality doesn't always mean treating everybody exactly the same. Sometimes it requires treating different people differently according to their needs and circumstances to ensure that everyone has meaningful access to the economic, social, and political benefits in our society. And it means understanding that disproportionate impacts of certain policies or practices, for example, Black men are more likely to be arrested by police in BC than other racialized groups. This may indicate that this disproportionate impact may indicate systemic inequalities even when no one is intentionally discriminating against each other. And that is what substantive equality means in our law. Despite our international law commitments to these rights, our report details where we're falling short of the commitments in regard to housing, income supports, the workforce, the education system, and the healthcare system. And I'm going to go a bit more into detail now on those. In our research, unaffordable, inaccessible, and inappropriate housing quickly and unsurprisingly rose to the top of the human rights issues facing British Columbians. BC residents face the highest rate of unaffordable housing in Canada. This is in part why homelessness and encampments are on the rise. The 2023 homeless count identified 31% more people experiencing homelessness when compared with 2020-21. Violations of the right to housing compromise people's safety and dignity and expose vulnerable people to increased risk of violence and exploitation. The effects are particularly acute for certain populations of people. Violence against women, for example, is a leading cause of homelessness, and increased violence is one of its impacts. Young women without homes are at high risk of violence of all kinds. 63% have been assaulted and 37% have been sexually assaulted. We heard from service providers that many women leave abusive partners only to return after they cannot find safe, affordable housing for their families. As one provider put it, they are given the difficult choice of violence on the street or violence at home. The right to housing is intimately related to the right to an adequate standard of living, which often depends on the social safety net of minimum wage and social assistance. Currently, the social safety net falls short. About 1 in 9 British Columbian residents, which is 11.6%, lives in poverty as of 2022, which is an increase of almost 8% in 2020. Discrimination on the basis of social conditions such as poverty or homelessness is widespread, damaging, and well documented. Our research shows that discrimination entrenches conditions of poverty. For example, we heard about employers screening out job applicants from low-income neighborhoods and people who appear to be experiencing poverty being denied services on public transportation or even medical care. Despite stigma and discrimination facing people living in poverty, such discrimination is not prohibited in law, although I have repeatedly called for changes to those laws, echoing years of advocacy from other organizations as well. Minimum wages and social assistance rates are far below the poverty threshold. About 1 in 9 BC residents lives in poverty, while an unacceptable 1 in 8 BC children lives in poverty. Rates are far higher among Indigenous and racialized children, reaching 1 in 3 on rural reserves. In addition, children in single mother families experience poverty at much higher rates, 28% higher than children in coupled families. And this illustrates the intimate connection between child poverty and women's poverty. Turning now to employment. An adequate standard of living, as we know, as I've mentioned already, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with the relationship between our employment, and our rights in the workplace and our economic well-being. For example, compared with men, women are more likely to work part-time and only earn 68 cents on every dollar that men earn. Indigenous women are less likely than non-Indigenous people to hold secure jobs. People with disabilities are significantly less likely than other groups to be employed. A recent estimate by Statistics Canada suggests that over 40% of people with disabilities who are not currently employed would be able to work in a workplace that is truly accessible to them. Workers who come to BC temporarily via the Temporary Foreign Workers Program are especially vulnerable as their immigration status is tied to their employment. For example, some workers we met described being put in housing that is moldy, unventilated, and either freezing cold or boiling hot. They talked about being put on curfews and denied guests, including advocacy workers. And that's actually our spotlight on this section goes into much more detail on the rights of temporary foreign workers. Turning now to the rights in healthcare and the healthcare system. This inequalities in the healthcare system is something I've heard about repeatedly throughout my first five-year term as commissioner, particularly from Indigenous communities. The right to health entitles everyone to the highest attainable standard of health, but many people in BC lack access to basic care. As I mentioned, Indigenous people report widespread discrimination in trying to access services where stereotypes can result in a denial of services and ultimately result in serious bodily harm. People with marginalized identities live shorter lives, report worse mental health, and experience discrimination in the healthcare system. For example, compared with the highest income group, those in the lowest income group experience more than double the rate of treatable mortality and nearly triple the rate of preventable mortality. In another example, the suicide rate amongst Status First Nation youths are more than triples the rate among BC youth. A tragic statistic. This healthcare system has been overburdened not just by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the toxic drug crisis, which has killed thousands of BC residents every year. Yet people seeking treatment face significant barriers, including inadequate staffing, confused access requirements, and insufficient social supports. Marginalization of drug users, often intersecting with other forms of marginalization, has been a key barrier to implementing or advancing these supports. Turning then to education. In regard to the right to education, we found that there are large differences between groups in educational outcomes. Evidence shows that groups with worse outcomes have faced exclusion, racism, and discrimination in schools. For example, 92% of all students complete secondary school in 6 years, but only 78% of students with disabilities and 75% of Indigenous students. We spotlighted the experiences of LGBTQ2SAI+ students in schools and controversy around the SOGI 123 curriculum, or materials rather, a supplementary education resource designed to create inclusive educational spaces for the growing number of people who identify within this community. The high levels of mis- and disinformation about these programs undermine the right for education for trans and gender diverse youth. Other systemic inequalities we examined relate to our rights to bodily and psychological safety and equality in both public and private spaces. The right to fair treatment in public spaces entitles everyone to full and free participation in social, political, and cultural life. In recent years, this right has come under threat from a rise in hate and from far-right movements that aim to silence the voices of marginalized people. Hate is common both in public outdoor spaces and online. 1 in 5 Canadians, nearly 1 in 3 racialized people, have experienced some form of hate, harassment, or violence online. Hate incidents rose dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic and again in response to recent events such as the violence in Gaza. This rise is reflected in police-reported hate crimes to some extent, but also in the many incidents not reported to police. As trust in institutions falls, hate is increasingly grounded in misinformation and disinformation shared online, such as racist conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 pandemic, denial of graves at Indian residential schools, and protests of Soji 123. Mis and disinformation, which is false or misleading information, continues to play a central role in propagating hate and silencing people, particularly online. Misinformation often amplifies hatred towards marginalized groups and can pull people towards extreme views, even far-right radicalization. Mis and disinformation is incredibly easy to access online as recommendation algorithms saturate users in extreme content. The right to safety and equality also extends to the family sphere. More than 3/4 of police reported intimate partner violence were women and girls. The family law legal aid system is drastically underfunded, which puts more women and girls and gender diverse people at risk of family violence. Other systems also increase risk. For example, one Indigenous woman described how she was afraid to call the police or to seek medical assistance based on past experiences that made her fear that further harm would come to her through the criminal justice system or the healthcare system. Immigrants and newcomers who experience violence in this family sphere may also hesitate to report what they're going through for fear that it will impact their immigration status that will lead to deportation or child apprehension. In addition to these issues, freedom from undue state interference also rose to the top. The right to fair treatment in the criminal justice system entitles everyone to equitable treatment by police and correctional institutions. Indigenous and racialized people, as well as people with mental health or substance use disorders, are at severely increased risk of interaction with the criminal justice system. For example, on any given day in 2023, about 1,829 individuals were in BC correctional centers, and over 2/3 were dealing with mental health or substance use issues. 2/3 of people in corrections. Indigenous, Black, and other racialized people are significantly overrepresented in their interactions with police. In our own research from a report we called Equity is Safer, we found that Indigenous, Black, and West Asian or Arab people were significantly more likely to be detained or arrested by the police forces that we looked at than the general population was. For example, in Vancouver, an Indigenous man is over 16 times more likely to be arrested than a non-Indigenous man. In addition, the CBC Deadly Force database found that Indigenous and Black people are overrepresented in police-involved deaths, and we are currently undertaking an inquiry into the use of force by police. Many people with mental health and substance use disorders receive treatment in correctional centers, but they are also often subject to traumatizing uses of force, such as segregation, which can create additional risk for people with these issues after discharge. For example, rates of fatal overdose more than triple shortly after leaving custody. The child protection system is also a key way in which the state kind of runs up against our liberty or freedom rights. While the number of children and youth in care has decreased in recent years, the child welfare system continues to disproportionately impact children from marginalized families, particularly those who are Indigenous, experiencing poverty, or living with disabilities. For example, despite making up only 10% of the population, 68% of children and youth in care are Indigenous. Children and youth are often placed in care due to so-called neglect, yet their families often face systemic barriers that masquerade as neglect, but are in fact outside of parental control. Examples include the absence of affordable housing and mental health supports. For children and youth with disabilities, a lack of resources during critical developmental periods can result in health consequences that cascade into inequities throughout their lifetime. Resources are gated behind a diagnosis, and not all diagnoses are treated equally. Families are pushed to the limit, and some consider placing their children within the system in order to access support. Finally, we have highlighted that all human rights depend on a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Climate change, extreme weather, pollution, and other environmental crises threaten this crucial foundation of human existence. This harm falls disproportionately on marginalized people who have contributed least to the crisis and whose rights are already least secure. This was evident in recent years as unprecedented flooding, heat waves, and wildfires destroyed biodiversity, lives, and property across the province. For example, during the 2021 heat dome, heat-related deaths were disproportionately high for people over the age of 70, those living in poverty, and among persons with specific disorders. I'm pausing for a moment because my notes cut off and I don't want to throw our wonderful ASL interpreter by going off too far off script. So give me a moment and I will be right there with you. So I was speaking about the 2021 heat dome, and I talked about the disproportionately high impact on people from certain communities, the disorders that people had that made them particularly subject to high heat-related deaths were people with schizophrenia, substance use disorder, epilepsy, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, depression, asthma, mood and anxiety disorders, and diabetes. Government response to these events has also raised human rights issues, as, for example, temporary foreign workers were impacted by the 2021 flooding throughout the Fraser Valley, but reports from workers and advocates indicate their workers' rights and well-being may have been deprioritized during that emergency. Indigenous people remain experts on climate adaptation, but their voices have too often been discounted by mainstream initiatives. Centering Indigenous perspectives can revitalize climate adaptation strategies, as has been seen recently in this wider recognition of cultural burning and Indigenous fired stewardship, which is definitely a step in the right direction. The systemic inequities highlighted in this report impact all of us, but disproportionately harm those who are most marginalized in our society. The 10 issues here are by no means experienced in isolation. Many residents in the province experience violations of their human rights in multiple areas of their lives in ways that intersect and compound harm. It is only with understanding that we can act. While this report focuses on where we continue to fall short in upholding the rights of all British Columbians, we also honor the many powerful ways that people in all walks of life are resisting oppression, standing up for human rights, and disrupting systems to create better ones. My hope is that this report will help us see these issues more clearly as human rights problems, and that this clarity will serve as a catalyst for change. Thank you so much again for being with us today, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Kasari. I think we'll stop the screen share now so that we can have a discussion and address some of the questions that are coming up. So I'm just going to shift over to the questions here. Thank you so much to those of you who have been submitting questions and also had submitted questions in advance of the webinar today. And thank you to Kasari for that really, really great overview of what the report is, what it reflects around what we heard across the province, and the importance of naming and talking about the things that we heard in the form of the Rights in Focus report. Sorry, the first question that I wanted to ask that actually came up as a pre question within our registration, and it sort of came up in a number of different ways from folks in different questions in the registration. But the crux of the question is, how may this report improve the human rights of Indigenous people in BC, and how does it hold colonial organizations accountable? So if you could speak to that, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. Thanks, Megan. And thank you for those who are sending in questions as we go. You know, the report is really intended to, as I've mentioned, kind of map out the landscape of human rights in the province or understand the landscape of human rights in the province. And we know that Indigenous rights are absolutely essential to that picture. So you'll see throughout the report a focus on the rights and experiences of Indigenous people, and if you're interested in more detail about who we consulted with and who we spoke to, this report is very much informed by a long process of engagement as well. Although much of what's cited here is also based on the secondary research as well. So you'll see people's perspectives reflected, I hope, and certainly a focus on the rights of Indigenous people and the experiences of Indigenous people. As I noted, there are no recommendations in this report. So the idea is that we are able to take this report, again, us as an organization, as well as advocates in the community. We very much wrote this in hopes that it would be useful to others in service of the work that so many people are doing in community already, and that they can use this to further bolster that work. So I'm hopeful that it will be able to leverage change in that way as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kasari. There are two questions that have come up in the Q&A that I think sort of tie together. One person has asked, and I'll sort of articulate the second part of this question, which was a specific example. They've asked, how will documenting of the landscape of human rights on the province impact the strategic plan of the BCOHRC? We're interested to see how your office and we in our work can mitigate or end some of these human rights violations. And then we've had a participant who has also asked about inquiry and how do we make determinations around inquiry. They are specifically interested in discrimination that happens within education. And they've outlined some specific experiences that they've had within the education system dealing with bullying, racism, discrimination. So their inquiry, I think their question sort of ties to the other question around how we use the tools that we have in order to address specific issues that come up in the report. So maybe we can put those questions together and answer them at the same time.
Sure. So a little bit of context about our office that might help answer this question. We are 5 years in. 5 years ago, there was no Human Rights Commissioner or Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. And in fact, we went 17 years in the province without a public body that was tasked with addressing systemic human rights issues. So when the legislation was changed and created this role, I was appointed to the role as the first commissioner to hold this completely independent role. The first task was, sort of simultaneous task to try to implement the mandate, work towards the mandate, as well as create an office. So we had no staff and no budget and no space. So we've done that building over the last 5 years. So we had a strategic plan for these 5 years that we've been working through, and we're now at this wonderful evolution in our life as an organization to go into the next 5-year strategic plan. And that's what we're going to be working on this fall, and slightly into the new year, we'll be publishing the strategic plan early in 2025. And it's great timing. We lined it up so that this report would come out. We would have done this extensive research. The other pieces of research that went into this is we did 4 community briefs that around the province that were based almost much more so on the voices of folks in each of those communities to really do deep dives and understand what human rights issues they were experiencing. So we're bringing all that information together, as well as the consultations we do across all of our projects, to ensure that the work that we do is directly connected to what the issues we've identified here and that have been identified to us repeatedly by people in community. It directly influences where we will go with our strategic plan, and you will be able to see that as we work through it over the next few months. It's also not to say that we've waited till now. Certainly, everything that I think I can speak on behalf of all of our team to say everything that we hear in community directly influences our work as we go, and certainly in my role as commissioner, it does. So. For example, that's where some of our inquiry work has come from. So our first inquiry was into the rise of hate during COVID-19, because we were hearing so much about people's experiences with hate incidents. throughout that early pandemic period, that it rose to the top of the issues that we thought we could try to engage these new inquiry powers with. So that's an example of how it showed up. Same with understanding the role of policing in people's lives, particularly racialized people and people with mental health and substance use disorders. And that work has become central to the work that we've done throughout the last number of years, including the report I mentioned called Equity is Safer, and the inquiry that we are currently working on, which is around the use of force in policing. So just a couple of examples to show you how we have built that work. I also, as I say, hope that it will be very informative for other communities, not necessarily to show them something, or community organizations, I should say, not necessarily to show them something they don't know. I know that much of this is echoing back what we have heard, but hopefully as a tool to amplify their voices and the work that they're doing. And so part of how we're trying to support that work, or did try to support that work, is we had a number of formal relationships and informal relationships across the province with organizations that we call community connectors. And we gave grants, small grants, to be able to facilitate their conversations in community, to bring those voices back, as well as a community advisory group that led some of this, gave guidance to us on some of this work. So that not only is what we did in the past, but I think really informs where this report will go, because we know we have a number of people deeply embedded and invested in this work going forward. Oh, and I'm sorry, on the inquiry, I didn't answer fully the inquiry question. So give you a glimpse of one of the factors that we take into account when we decide what inquiry to do, some of the issues that have risen to the top and what we've heard. The other pieces are what's manageable given what else is going on in the organization, what we're able to undertake, where we see a moment where we can capitalize potentially on some other movements for change happening in the province, whether that's from community or within government, where we know some change is happening that we could try to inform the human rights direction it's taking. So there's a lot of factors that go into deciding what inquiries we take on. Right now we are conducting 3 inquiries. I've mentioned the police use of force. We're also doing one on how vulnerable adults are detained by health authorities when there is perceived abuse or neglect going on, and the rights of those vulnerable adults when they're being held in detention. And we're doing another one on the exclusion of media from the decampment work of or forced eviction of encampment residents in East Hastings last spring, and the exclusion of media from that. So a very narrow look, but really a broader kind of contribution, hopefully, to freedom of press and the important role that plays in our democracy. So that gives you a sense of the breadth of inquiry work that we're doing. That's going to keep us busy for the next number of months, and then we'll be looking at and engaging in some further inquiry work. If you'd like to contribute an idea, please feel free to email us at info@bchumanrights.ca. Send us your ideas. We keep track of everyone for an inquiry, and we put it through our inquiry process. So we look forward to hearing from you that way.
That's great, Kasari. You took it right from me. I was going to say, if folks do have things they want to share with our office or feedback about where they think we should be spending our time. And I know some things have come up in the Q&A where folks are providing some specific examples of where their concerns live and what their experiences have been, particularly in rural and remote First Nations communities. Please do reach out to our office, and we hope to continue that conversation with you. info@bchumanrights.ca, and maybe we'll get to you're way ahead of me, has already popped it into the chat there. So I think we have time for maybe one, maybe 2 more questions, which there are quite a few that have come in. So big gratitude to everyone that has submitted. And if we don't get to your question today, please do follow up with us via the email that you see in the chat right now. And we will try to get back to you with a response. The question I wanted to ask is sort of a culmination again of questions that came in through the registration, where a lot of folks who work in various sectors that we have highlighted in the report really articulated their desire to make change within their sector. So whether that's education or healthcare, child welfare system, across the board, folks who are attending today are really interested in, I see that, these issues in the system that I work in, how do I contribute to change on the ground? And so maybe you could just speak a little bit to that. So if folks are interested in understanding what their role is in change making and trying to impact these systems that we are seeing human rights concerns come up in, what in your perspective does that look like for folks in those sectors?
That's a hard question to answer in the general, especially since I know it's a diverse audience here today. So we're not all working from one perspective. What I see in the questions as I'm skimming them quickly, although I'm certainly relying on Megan to pose them to me, but quickly trying to skim as well to see where the interests are. And I see the deep desire to understand and engage. And that's certainly what we're trying to do with this report is build understanding. I may have heard me say earlier, we can't act without understanding. And that's what we're trying to do here is build our knowledge as an organization, our knowledge as a province, as a sort of activated public to what are these issues? What evidence can we draw from to really leverage change, and specifically what evidence can we base our public policies on? If you're in government and you're working on these issues actively, where do we turn to for the right evidence? And that's sort of been a drumbeat throughout my term, certainly, is I work towards evidence-based decision-making. I firmly believe that evidence-based decision-making is how we move away from bias and stereotyping and entrenching inequalities in policy and practice by making our decisions based on real experiences of real people, which, it's sometimes sounds a bit obvious, but often, as many of you will know well, is not actually our practice. Our decisions will be influenced by political considerations, popularity, these kinds of pieces, as opposed to what's actually working, what's actually saving lives, what's actually improving human dignity in the province, and how do we do that? And how do we know that? We listen to people about what they're experiencing. So I appreciate the energy that people are showing to really understanding these issues. And maybe because there's a couple questions just right in front of me that I can jump to about that, about sort of understanding, which is, there's a question here about why GLADU and other well-intentioned interventions have not had the desired effect on the disproportionate impact of Indigenous or disproportionate representation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. I'm not sure I have a brilliant answer to that, except I do have a couple thoughts on it, which is we can have legal changes, but if we don't adequately fund the solutions that come out of those, and adequately support them with resources, then they won't make the change. So GLADU reporting is an important part of understanding the impacts of colonization on people's actions and behavior that may lead to criminal convictions, and understanding that impact in sentencing people, particularly obviously Indigenous people, with the impact of colonization. We know that fact GLADU reporting was severely underfunded in the province for many years, and I think that I understand there has been more of a focus on that in recent years, although I don't know what impact we've seen from it. I also think that's only one aspect of the problem. If we understand that Indigenous people are targeted by police, potentially very subconsciously, not necessarily intentionally, but we see a highly disproportionate impact of policing on Indigenous people. Well, that's another reason that people are overrepresented in corrections, which needs fixes further up in the criminal justice system. We need to address how we do certain policing practices and and really implement the recommendations that have been issued by us and many others about how to reform our policing system to try to deconstruct the discrimination that is embedded into some of those systems. That's just one more example. So I think it's not a one solution fix.
Thanks, Kasari. And we have about 1 minute left, but I did want to address one of the questions because I think it's a good way to sort of wrap our conversation here today. Somebody has mentioned that they find the work that you do inspiring, and they imagine that it's quite difficult work. And they want to know what inspires you in your work specifically. So I think that's a nice place for us to close out today. And then I might do a little bit of housekeeping before we fully close the webinar. But what inspires you? What keeps you going in this work?
I think I would be so much more discouraged if I wasn't doing this work is really the quickest answer to that. I think it's for me just doing my little piece of the puzzle and working with the incredible team that we have and working alongside people in community is the only way that I can stay inspired and hopeful, because it is so easy to get discouraged if you're not able to take action. So it's really by taking action and working alongside like-minded folks that is the fire that keeps burning for me personally. Thank you for the question and thank you for the kind words.
That's a lovely spot to leave it. And I want to echo it is also having folks such as everybody who's joined us today, maintaining interest, wanting to know more. Everybody who's in this space today is part of that journey as well, and part of that story. Before we close out, I just want to once again express a lot of gratitude for the questions today. If we didn't get to it, once again, please do send it to us via email, and we'll work to get back to you with a response. And we hope that you're leaving today with a stronger sense of the Rights in Focus Lived Realities in BC report, the work that we do, the purpose of the report, how we did that work, and all of the great info that Kasari shared. If you haven't read the report, we'll drop the link as well into the chat before we leave today. We hope you get a chance to engage with it. And if you're interested in learning more about our office, you can visit our website, which we will also put in the chat. And we also have opportunities for learning that are upcoming. So if you're interested in learning more about the law in BC, that being the BC Human Rights Code, we have a code learning session coming up on October 10th that will specifically dig into that content. And we can also pop the registration link, I'll just do it right now, into the chat. And once you leave here today, you will be directed toward a survey. We are interested in hearing from you about this session today, but also some other thoughts around human rights in BC and some of the things that we've talked about here in the session. Otherwise, we are wrapping up a few minutes behind. Thank you for staying with us for 2 extra minutes, and we're grateful that you joined us today, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, folks.